All right. Hi, Leslie. This is Ankita. So, as Adam introduced me, I'm the Region 11 coordinator of the SPJ, and I'm in charge of California, Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, and the Mariana Islands. And it's really a pleasure to meet you. So, yeah, I'll just start with your introduction and then I'll dive into the questions.
Okay.
So, I'm going to start off, the questions will sort of be in the range of I'll start off with your early career, and then I'll sort of go into your the middle of your career, that your transition to reporting on UFOs, and then I also want to discuss your book Surviving Death, because I have a keen interest in that topic, but that'll be towards the end. So that's pretty much how it's going to be.
Okay. Sounds good. Great. Great to meet you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And yeah, so hi everyone. This is Ankita Kumar, and I am here with Leslie Kean, who is an investigative journalist and a New York Times bestselling author of UFOs, generals, pilots, and government officials go on the record. She has been published widely in several newspapers in the US and abroad as well, including the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, the Huffington Post, and Kane is widely known for reporting on UFOs, and we'll be talking about that. And yeah, and Kane has also authored other books called Surviving Death and Burma's Revolution of the Spirit. And I think I will let Leslie talk more about herself rather than giving her an introduction. So uh, yeah, I also would like to mention that this event is co-sponsored by SPJ New England, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to moderate this session with Leslie. So, Leslie, I'll start off with the beginning. So, I was reading up about your life, and I saw that you were an activist and you went to Burma for a bit. So, I wanted to understand, how those years as an activist and going to Burma really shaped your understanding of international reporting and eventually motivated you to become a journalist.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. And I'll keep it brief because we have an hour, right? So I'm not, I could answer that question for 45 minutes, but I'm going to really try to be succinct so we can cover a lot of ground, which I think is better. So basically what happened was, I had a close friend who had been a monk in Burma for many years, and he had been in the jungles, because there were refugees fighting this murderous regime at the time back in the early 90s. And I was very moved by the stories he told me, and I started to read up on Burma and just became personally interested in it because of the culture, the Buddhist culture. I had been a Buddhist previously and practiced a lot of Buddhism, and I was just very inspired by Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Nobel Peace Prize winner. I guess she may not have won it at that time. I don't remember the timing, but anyway, I ended up going to Burma with my friend Alan, who had been a monk there for years, so he knew the language and everything, and spent 2 months there documenting a lot of the situation there, interviewing former political prisoners, spending time at Aung San Suu Kyi's compound, got a lot of incredible video footage because they were very, at that time, inaccessible and kind of reclusive from the world. Not much was known about Burma. And so I just documented as much as I possibly could, both through video and interviews. And then when I came back, I ended up being a guest on a public radio station in Berkeley, California, which is where I was living, and to talk about, I met a reporter from that radio station. I don't remember exactly how, but I went on and was a guest and talked about my experiences with being in Burma, and ended up becoming friends with this reporter who ran this investigative news program out of this station in Berkeley. And I eventually was offered a job there. And in the meantime, I co-authored this book about, that you mentioned, Burma's Revolution of the Spirit, about the struggle of democracy for Burma with my colleague, Alan Clements. That's a whole other story. And it was mainly a photographic book, and we published that. But that's how I sort of got into, Burma sort of opened the door for me to get into journalism in a bigger way. I started off just sort of gathering information on it without really knowing what journalism was really all about. And then when I worked with this reporter at this public radio station, it was called KPFA Radio, he was also a freelance writer. And so I kind of was mentored by this person. And I learned, we did a lot of stories together about the information I brought back from Burma. So we published a whole series of articles as freelancers, and he had access to a lot of, outlets because he had been already a freelancer, and in those days, it wasn't like it is today. There was a lot of freelance publishing that went on, much more so than there is today. And so we just did all these articles together. And it was by doing that work with this person and being trained by this journalist who was very well experienced that I learned about journalism. I learned how you put together a story, what you need, what kind of proof you need, what kind of backup you need, how many sources you need, how do you write the opening for the story to get people interested, how does it shape, all the things you need to know. I never went to school. I just learned from this person. And so then on the radio station, I also learned print journalism as well. So I kind of got a training in both broadcast journalism. So I became part of this radio show and was one of the hosts and producers of this radio show that was so I learned print journalism and then broadcast journalism. And that sort of takes me to and then I did that for a few years as a regular job. And that takes me to the point where UFOs kind of landed in my lap one day. So I don't know if you have any more questions you want to ask about any of that, or if that summarizes it pretty well for you.
It does. I did have a couple of questions actually, and one of them was about the senior journalist who mentored you in the California stint. And
again, I'm sorry, I missed what you just say.
You had mentioned in an interview 2 years ago with, I think, Ben Sinclair about a senior journalist who had mentored you in the California stint. So I was curious to know who this person is and how that shaped your reporting and how you ended up reporting on UFOs.
Yeah, so this must be the same person I'm talking about, right? A California. Yeah, so his name is Dennis Bernstein. And I think he's still doing this investigative news program on the station called KPFA, which is a very progressive, kind of scrappy, part of the Pacific Network. Listener supported. They were very proud of that. They were not taking money from corporations, so they had a freedom to say whatever they wanted to say. And he was the person who kind of taught me all these things. I mean, I think he's still there. Yeah, and he was the person who also hired me to work on the broadcast show as well after we did these stories together, these print stories. So I'm indebted to him. I wouldn't have been able to do anything I did if it wasn't for his mentorship and guidance. And it was really years of learning and learning by doing, basically. I was fortunate enough to be in that position where I was learning by doing as opposed to going to school and struggling. This just sort of came into my life very organically. And I think the trip to Burma is what really started the whole thing, as you pointed out. Yeah.
Full disclosure, I was really interested in knowing more about Burma, about your Burma stint, because I went to the same college as Aung San Suu Kyi. So,
oh, nice. Wow. In Burma, or was that in the UK?
Yeah, actually.
What's that?
In India.
In India. Okay, that's right. I know she spent a lot of time in India, right? Earlier in life. That's fascinating. Were you there around the same time? I think you're younger.
There. I was in college when she came to visit us. We had our college opened an Aung San Suu Kyi Center for Peace.
That's so fantastic. Wow, that gives me chills. That's wonderful. Yeah. Now she's locked up somewhere and just suffering horribly. It's just a terrible, terrible scenario.
Yeah. I'm so glad that I could talk to. I was so happy to read about you spending time in Burma, because it's very rare to meet somebody who's been to that part of the world. I feel like we're represented. So thank you.
Well, thank you for being interested. Yeah, I mean, Burma's not a place that a lot of people visit, especially back then. It was just so closed off and it was kind of hard to go to. But yeah, it was just an absolutely beautiful country. And I had such profound experiences there. The people there were just unbelievable. Such, inspirational people. I mean, and so devoted to their country and their struggle, and to Aung San Suu Kyi and to the whole movement, the democracy movement there. And what they were willing to sacrifice for that was just astonishing. They're just really, really inspiring people. So it was a gift to be able to go there.
I have another, it's sort of personal question. It's sort of I moved to the West Coast and I realized that the East Coast and West Coast are so different from each other. And I know you made that move when you came to California. So I wanted to know a little more about how did you, manage that big move, from the East Coast to the West Coast?
Yeah, you mean in terms of like getting used to it, or?
But yeah, in the journalism world, did you see any difference between both the coasts and how journalism was, approached in these places?
Yeah, because when I actually moved out there, I hadn't really, let's see, it really was when I moved to California from New York, which was in 1989, that my whole interest in trajectory in journalism started. So I wasn't involved at all before that with it. And that was when I was in California that I met the former monk from Burma who kind of introduced me to the whole scenario there. And then and it was in 95, I think, that I went over there. So there was a number of years where I was kind of learning, but I didn't really have anything to compare it to because I wasn't involved prior to that. I mean, California definitely had a very open-minded, kind of progressive, free-spirited attitude, maybe more so than the sort of more, I don't know, it's newer, it's fresher, it's more radical than maybe some people would consider the East Coast to be. But I love both places, and I'm an East Coast person, so it's home to me. So, but I was in the Bay Area for 13 years, and I loved being there. It was really great. It's a really great place. Yeah, but they are different. They really are. Um,
I'm going to fast forward to some questions I know some students would definitely want to know. Is that how did you land your first story on UFOs? I actually missed asking this question to Ralph, so I'm going to pose it to you. How did you get into it? Like, how did you go about, how did you find the story? How did it land, in your lap sort of, and you sort of ran with it? Can you tell us more about it? It sort of sounds like a thriller movie, so I want to know more about it.
Yeah, I definitely a thriller movie. I don't know about that, but it was pretty interesting. Yeah. And it did. It kind of landed in it kind of found me. So what happened was I was doing the job that I was described to you at this radio station, every day going in and reporting on. There were 3 producers and we all had one story to do every day, 1/3 of the show. And so I was doing my job there and covering all kinds of things. And then this colleague, and I had read a few books on UFOs in the past before that. So I had sort of an average level curiosity that anybody might have who had read a couple of books. I mean, I wasn't like interested in it in any big way or anything. It never would have occurred to me that I would ever be professionally involved with something like that. It was just sort of a curiosity like anybody might have. And so just to give that background, so what happened was a colleague from France sent me in this manila envelope. It just arrived in the mail because in those days we didn't do a lot of emailing. I don't know if we'd had any yet. It was in, let me turn this phone off. In like 98, I think it was that this happened. He sent me a report that had been put together by high-level military people in France. They were retired generals, admirals, the former head of the Space Studies Center in France, which was the equivalent of NASA here, a former head of the police chief, very, very, like there were 3 or 4 4-star generals, very, very high level retired people. A lot of them were part of this think tank in France. And they had spent 3 years investigating UFOs by interviewing pilots and really looking at only official cases, official data. They had access to really great data and really great cases. And they did this investigation and they wrote up a report on it. It was called the Cometa Report. And that was the name of this group of 13 people. And this person in France was involved with the publishing of that report. And he had it translated. Lawrence Rockefeller, who actually was a wealthy American kind of philanthropist who was interested in this topic, had funded the translation of that report. It was 90 pages. And I got this hard copy in the mail, and he said, "Would you like to write about this? You're the only person in America that has a copy." I read it, and I was completely blown away by that report because these officials laid out a bunch of cases that they had looked into. And then they drew the conclusion in the report that the most logical, valid, and rational explanation for the cases they studied was what they called the extraterrestrial hypothesis. They were basically saying, we've looked at cases for which conventional explanations can be ruled out, because they looked at cases where there's enough data to do that, right? You have to have a certain amount of data to rule out any conventional explanation. So they had these cases, and they went through all the possible explanations, and there weren't any conventional ones, and they just drew that conclusion, in black and white, that their best hypothesis is that we are being visited by something from somewhere else. Basically, what it was the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which was only an hypothesis. They said we can't prove this. But for me as a reporter, the fact that people at that high level would draw that conclusion was really significant, because in those days, UFOs were considered a complete joke, right? It's a very different world now than it was then. That was back, prior to, it was 1999, 1998. It was just, the culture did not take it seriously for 1 second. And so when you have high level military drawing a conclusion like that, to me, that was a huge thing. And so that's what got me started. I started to look into it more, and I took that report and tried to find maybe people in America. I remember interviewing people in America who might, looking at sort of the national security aspect of it, because that's what the report was focusing on. It was called UFOs and Defense. What are we prepared for? So it was really about the need to prepare pilots for possible encounters with these things, because it's dangerous if they don't expect something and it happens. So that was sort of the focus of it. And I started to look into that and reaching out to people. And then I pitched a story to the Boston Globe about that, because I had written for the Boston Globe before on other topics. And I had a very good relationship with the editor of the Sunday focus section, which was sort of like the news analysis section in the New York Times every Sunday. It was like a news analysis section that came out only on Sundays, where, you could write fairly long stories with sort of a slant to them. And, or you're trying to make a point, like long kind of opinion pieces, but this really wasn't that, but that was the perfect section for it. And this editor worked with me on the story. And all I can tell you is, in those days, it was like a huge obstacle course to get a story published about UFOs. I spoke to many editors who I had worked with in the past, who loved my work. And a lot of them were the Burma stories that I had done, but other stories too, that I published as a freelancer, and they loved them. And I bring them this. And even though we're talking about only things that generals and admirals have said, like, are you going to disbelieve these high level people? And they're not saying these are aliens. They're just saying we don't know what they are, but they might be extraterrestrial. Presented it very soberly like that. They just wouldn't touch it. It was like, it's so taboo and so stigmatized. And I remember there was one editor who really wanted it, but then he called me back a week later and said the higher levels had completely banished it. You just can't do it. So the Globe ended up publishing the story. And I can see the question, did the Globe publish it? Yes, but it was a struggle. This editor was really, really amazing. And at one point, she said to me, okay, I can't do this. We're canceling the whole thing. And we had worked on it for months. And I was just like devastated, She said, I can't make this happen. So then I went back to her a week later, and she was willing to pick it up again. But she did a lot of heavy editing, But it did come out. It came out in May of the year 2000. And it was almost, big Sunday paper. It was about 2/3 of the page on one of the inside pages. So she put pictures in there and everything. And it was a big deal, because no mainstream media at that time was covering this topic with any seriousness at all. And so it was like, she took a chance. She was afraid she'd be ridiculed or whatever. That was the risk then. And again, it's so different now that it's hard to imagine it. But it was the kind of thing where I didn't even want to tell my colleagues at KPFA that I was doing this, because it was so stigmatized. And I remember when I tried to tell, I thought, well, they're progressive people. They should be open-minded. But no, they weren't. I tried to tell them about it, and it was just, I didn't want to talk about it. It was just very, very bad. So she had the courage to do this. And the story was really, a major thing for anybody interested in the topic. It was like, oh my God, the mainstream media is covering this. And I got so much positive response. And pilots started contacting me and saying, I've never been able to tell my story to anyone. And I was just hooked from that moment on. I mean, it was that Boston Globe story that got me going on this, and I never wanted to go back and do anything else. One of the biggest questions I had in my mind then was, why is there this stigma? Why is this thing so taboo? Why do people ridicule it? Why isn't the Congress interested? If you have generals in France telling you there's a good chance we're being visited, even if it's only 5% or 1%, isn't that worth investigating, right? I mean, it was just this question like, why is there this strange attitude about this topic? And I was very interested in using journalism and facts to try to combat that. Because, there have been so many sensationalistic, conspiratorial, crazy things that have been out on the internet or out in the media about UFOs so that nobody took them seriously for good reason. And I really wanted to get to what are the actual facts? What do we know and what do we not know about this phenomenon? And how can I bring that forward in a mainstream environment in which it can actually reach people who have an impact on policy? And how can we get members of Congress and scientific community interested in looking into it through accurate reporting that isn't sensationalistic and is working with only very credible sources? So that was my inspiration once that first article came out. And then, it was a long journey, and then the 2017 New York Times story happened. But anyway, we can stop there if you want to ask more questions about that.
I'm curious to know the response of the scientific community to your report.
You mean the first one, then the Boston Globe? I don't think there was any really. The scientific community has been the slowest to come on board. There was one congressional staffer who wrote to the Boston Globe, and I thought that was really cool. And they were like praising them for doing the story, but no, I mean, I was surprised that there wasn't more response because I thought this was a huge story, and there wasn't scientific community, no response, Congress, no response, no other reporters, like I was a freelancer, right? So let's say some of these major investigative reporters that work for like the New Yorker or the Washington Post or the New York Times, that people like Seymour Hersh are really famous people, I thought, well, they're going to want to look into this, not a word from anyone. So even though the people involved directly were very positive about it, the larger world just wasn't that responsive. I had to keep pushing away because of that taboo. It was so intense. So, yeah.
So I know that the stigma, I mean, now I would say, I can say, I think you, Blumenthal, and a lot of handful of journalists across the world have broken the glass ceiling for journalists like me, who probably would want to take up a topic that's not in part of the mainstream. But the thing that I still, it boggles my mind, and I'm sure you might think about it too, why is the government not interested in involving more journalists in the initiatives they're taking regarding UFOs? Is it for concerns over military classified work, or I'm just curious to understand why they're not involving journalists more in this, because it's sort of creating this thing of secrecy, and then there's conspiracy theories, Area 51, like, watch parties and stuff like that. If the government really started involving journalists, then we would have more information out in the public. So why do you think that's not happening even today, after what, like 25 years since you wrote your report?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that journalists are much more involved than they ever have been, for sure. And I don't really think it's so much the responsibility of the government to work with the journalists. It's the responsibility of the journalists to report on what the government is doing and to get access to the government, and there are more and more people doing that, for sure. It's just hard to get that information. And you mentioned about classified. So much of the information that we all want, us journalists and everybody else want, is classified. So we come up against that problem all the time. Like an example being the David Grusch story, the whistleblower that came out in 23, and Ralph Blumenthal and I were the people that broke that story. And it ended up, he ended up in an open congressional hearing 2 months after that story came out. And he had a tremendously important things to say, but he couldn't prove any of them. He had no data that he could bring forward because it's all classified. So this is becoming more and more of a problem, but I would say, and there are members of Congress definitely who will work with journalists for sure, and they come out and they give statements to the media at a level they've never done before 2017. Never happened. They weren't even involved, you know. They've received enough briefings now, classified briefings, the ones that want them and that care, to be well informed. And therefore, that's what's motivated them to take the steps they've taken, which involves, you know, legislation and hearings, basically. So yeah, there's a level of access that we've never had before, but it's also very difficult because of the sensitivity of the information and the fact that so much of it is classified. That's really a problem. But I mean, having been around for 17 years with this prior to the New York Times article, which kind of changed everything, I'm just so aware of how great it is now compared to the way it was then. You know, it was like a desert then, and now we've had this gorgeous rain, and now everything's blooming, you know? That's sort of what it's like, even though we have a long way to go. But there weren't many journalists doing this before, and now there's a lot. And you know, they all want stories. Whereas before, like I said, I had to battle to get the stories published. Now everybody wants the stories. So it's very different. Yeah, and the response is much better too than it was then. There's less, people are interested now. They take it seriously. And I just kept chipping away at it all those years. And I think I was making progress with getting it out there, and the book made a big impact, but it wasn't the same as it is now.
So, has it been easier to get more information, you know, after the NYT article going out? Like, do you feel it's made your life easier and the life of other journalists easier?
Absolutely. Yeah, much easier. I mean, it's easier to place stories and to write stories because at least the media wants the stories and they're not as biased against the topic, although that's still a problem. So yeah, it's definitely easier than it was, to both write them, to get the sources, to get people on the record, to place the stories. As a freelancer, I mean, some of the reporters are not freelancers, but it's still, but there's still pushback. It's still not as good as it should be. Or, you know, we're dealing, I mean, we deal with that all the time, but comparatively to the way it was before, it's much, much better, much easier. Yeah.
And I see a question in the chat about how it came to be. So, can you tell us more about how you how how you went about writing that story?
Yeah, the way that miracle story happened, really, we have to thank Luis Elizondo for that story. What happened was, I had worked on this book, Surviving Death, which we mentioned. So my book came out in 2010, and then I spent some years traveling to other countries and kind of exploring what they were doing with UFOs and writing about that. And then I took some time to do my book, Surviving Death, which maybe took 4 years. That actually came out in 2017. So later that year, in 2017, I was called by sources. So over these years, I developed a number of sources that were insiders and got to know them very well, people that were deeply involved and had clearances and weren't necessarily very public about it. But I had these relationships with them, and the number of them worked with this program that at the Pentagon that we didn't even know existed. So what happened was I got a request from one of them to come to a meeting in DC at a hotel to meet Luis Elizondo, who was the head of a program at the Department of Defense called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which is the acronym ATIP. And he was resigning. And I met him on the very day that he was resigning. And he wanted to get his story out, basically, because he felt so restricted within the Department of Defense with what he felt needed to happen. He just felt he could not accomplish it given the pushback because of the stigma and other things, and the lack of resources that were provided, that he could accomplish more by going out into the public arena. So he decided to do that. He had written a resignation letter to Secretary of State Mattis. And I was called to this meeting with him, absolutely stunned to find that there was this program in the first place, because I had been out advocating for a government program to be set up. And then I find out there is one already, even though it was secret. And I was shown at that meeting, I got to not only talk to Mr. Elizondo about the program and everything, but I was shown his resignation letter to Mattis before it came out. I was shown some documentation of Harry Reid's involvement with this program, former Senate Majority Leader, who had actually, gotten the funding for it and made it happen, basically. There's documentation on that. And then I was shown these videos, these famous 3 videos that have since been released. 2 of them came out and with our story initially, and was just given Lou Elizondo's performance reviews and talked to him about what he was doing and the whole thing. And it was just so mind-blowing to me. It was like I couldn't have asked for anything more exciting for me, given the 17 years I had spent beating up against this taboo and feeling like I could only accomplish so much. And then to have a story like this was just, mind-blowing to me. It was really, really incredible, amazing people at that meeting. There were 4 people, 3 others besides Elizondo there. And what I did to make the story happen was, I went to my friend Ralph Blumenthal at that point, who had been working on a book about John Mack, a psychiatrist from Harvard involved with the study of UFOs. So I had known him through his work on that book. I'd gotten to know him, and I knew, he was a former full-time staffer at the New York Times and was at that point a freelancer. So I went to him with this information, and I had all the documentation and everything. And he pitched the story to the New York Times. I forget the name of whoever was the head. I'm blanking on his name. I'm sorry. But he knew who to go to at the New York Times. And we were able to have a meeting with Mark Mazzetti from the New York Times, who was the head of the investigations bureau from the Washington Bureau, we were in New York, but really the Washington Bureau was the one that would have handled a story like this. So we sat down with Mark Mazzetti at the headquarters in New York City, and we just laid out everything for him and showed him, we had people on the record, which was so important. We had the documents that showed how this thing was created. We had the videos. We had Lou's resignation letter. We had, all this stuff to make it a very solid story. And Mark took it back to the bureau in DC. And then we heard about a week later that we were greenlit and that we were going to be able to work with Helene Cooper, who is the Pentagon reporter for the New York Times. Absolutely incredible, accomplished reporter who I have great respect for. And to be able to work with her was just the greatest gift we could have ever wanted, And the 3 of us were just this amazing team. And so we just started to work on it. And one of the big moments was we needed to get Harry Reid on the record about having been involved with this secret program at the Department of Defense, which was studying UFOs. And he was one of the founders of the program. And we had no idea if he would be willing to do that. I mean, and our story kind of hinged on it. We had the documents. So we had a letter that he had written regarding this program, but we really didn't know how far he would go. So Helene Cooper flew out to Las Vegas to meet with him in person. And I'll never forget the call after she had that meeting with him. It was an hour, 2 hours. She sat down with him, not knowing what he was going to say. And she called me up and she said, guess what? He told me everything. And she got everything we could have ever wanted from him. Just laid it all out on the line. And when we had that, we knew we had a big story once we got him on the record. So that was a major step. And then it was just a matter of, working on the story. We had a lot of editing. We had to go back and forth with editors about things we wanted and didn't want in the story and that kind of stuff. And then it came out on the front page in the Sunday paper, which you couldn't ask for better placement than that, on December 17th in the hard copy. I think it was the 16th I don't remember, on the internet. It came out on the internet first. So that's how the whole thing happened. It was just a game changer for me. Yeah, amazing. I agree. It was amazing. And it changed a lot. And it was Lou Elizondo who really made all that happen. I mean, I'm happy that he approached me and wanted me to do that story, but if he hadn't resigned, there would be no story. So I give the credit to him, but and to the New York Times for being willing to take it on, because it was a taboo topic. But, you know, when you have a government agency within the Department of Defense, you know, that's what it takes for the New York Times. It's all legit. And we had Lou Elizondo on the record, we had Harry Reid on the record, and others who were involved. So yeah, it was really, really exciting.
This so it's like a dream come true for any journalist, particularly that call that you got that he said everything. I
Oh,
think
I know, that was so great. And I wasn't the one that went, but she was the person to go for sure. She was the correspondent for the New York Times. And yeah, it was just so wonderful when she said it. You know, he told me, he said everything. And we didn't know, she might have come back with nothing. You know, it was just a crapshoot. We had no idea. And then he turned out to be, he was just the most lovely person, Harry Reid. I mean, I had many conversations with him over the years, and he contributed to other stories we did for the Times as well. Just an absolute lovely, lovely person, and very committed and very knowledgeable about the topic. So we became, you know, he was just, yeah, it was just great. Really
and
great.
Leslie, I'm just gonna digress a little bit because this is one question that I think is very topical. Airline safety has become such a big issue, particularly after the start of this year, after the DC crash. And you talked about how you had pilots calling you up and saying, "We have seen things, we cannot talk to anybody about it," and how there were government programs to make sure there were no crashes. So, this is a topic that's not talked about when people are talking about airline safety. They're talking about anything and everything except UFOs. So, how important is your work, particularly during this time when airline safety has become such a big topic in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really, really is important. And just to go back a little bit, in the second story I did after the Boston Globe story was about airline safety, was about aviation safety cases. And there was a big report that had come out from a former NASA senior scientist about this that documented a lot of cases in which there were safety issues involved. So I've been focused on that all this time. And I always realized it was kind of a good way in because it gives people an excuse to care and take it seriously. You know, that you can't ignore aviation safety issues. So since then, the second story we did for the New York Times in May of 2019 that I did also with Helene Cooper and Ralph Blumenthal involved Navy pilots. It was a report with Ryan Graves. I don't know if you know the name Ryan Graves, but he was a young active duty pilot at the time who was coming forward with reports of lots and lots of sightings off the East Coast of the United States by not himself as much as members of his squadron, and frequent sightings. And so we reported on that in May of 2019. That story was it actually got more views than the 2017 one did. It was really, really widely read. And since then, Ryan Graves has become a major figure in the aviation safety advocacy world. And he has started a group called Americans for Safe Aerospace. And it's all about advocating for legislation to, dealing with aviation safety issues, for making it possible for pilots to report, for requiring the FAA to stop blocking them from reporting, all the stuff you need to do to open up the world of aviation safety. He's doing it, and he has the respect of members of Congress, meets with them, goes to conferences a lot. So it's a major thread and a major aspect of the issue that's being addressed at high levels, and very important. And Ryan Graves is the person, if anybody's interested in learning more about that, to go to his organization. And there's I think he said, and he was one of the people who testified before Congress too, with David Grusch in July of 2023. There was an open congressional hearing. He was one of the people. And yeah, he's actually lives in New Hampshire. Somebody just put up that he's from Boston. I've been to his home. He's in New Hampshire, just north of Boston. And yeah, so you can listen to him at that open congressional hearing. He's very solid and serious and devoted and young, and really has accomplished a huge amount. So it's a really important aspect to this, because I think he said that it's only a small percentage. I forget the number. It was a huge percentage of pilots that do not report these events. Still, they're afraid to. And crazy, right? When you think about it rationally, like they have an encounter with some unknown object that's potentially a threat or a safety hazard and they don't report it. It's like, what? Why would you not report it? That shows that the stigma still has some power there, and they're afraid of their jobs being affected, even today. So his role has been to really combat that, and to try to make it safe for pilots and they can go to his organization to report events, and he'll follow up on them. He'll investigate. He'll, take people in to see members of Congress if they need to, all of that stuff. So yeah. But I remember being onto that back in 2001, when nobody would really listen. I always recognized how important it was. And it was also part of that initial French report, too. A lot of that motivation was because of safety hazards. So, yeah, I don't think they'll have to be as scared to fly, but, we haven't had any crashes or anything from UFOs that I'm aware of. But, I always look out the window when I'm flying, hope to see one out there. But
And this all this discussion about stigma is making me wonder how far back in history can we go when it comes to establishing when the stigma began? Because all the ancient cultures, Egypt, the Harappan culture, they all talk about UFOs. I'm sure in China they talked about UFOs if we dig around. So it's not that this discussion's not been there. It's been there for since humanity, evolved. So I'm wondering at what point the stigma started. It's just something.
You're right. Yeah. I mean, and also South America had to Asia, they're not so uptight about it like we are here. That's what you're saying, right? They're open about it in these countries, right? Like
Yeah.
it's part of the culture. You just accept it. And that's true in South America too. I mean, there's just so much activity there. And then they have government agencies in South America where they're open about it. And it's not like they're trying to hide anything like they are here, right? So it's kind of strange. I mean, and my understanding of it is back, we first started to deal with this UFO phenomenon during the Cold War back in the late 40s, early 50s. And we were in this heavy duty Cold War with Russia. So there was a need to protect, not to show vulnerability by saying, oh, there's things flying around here, we can't explain them. We were worried that maybe the Russians would take advantage of that in some way, or try to make us think there was a UFO when there wasn't one, whatever. We just felt it important to keep that secret. And I understand that. But then what happened was there was and people were very interested and focused on it. And it was in the media and everything. And there was a meeting that a group of CIA handpicked scientists called, and I think it was in 1953, called the Robertson Panel. And they convened for a few days, and they wrote up this document, which was later, it was secret at the time, but later released through the Freedom of Information Act, that laid out ridicule. It says it in black and white. You could use ridicule as a tool to damp down the enthusiasm of people for this topic, and to infiltrate educational facilities and to TV commercials and movies and try to make it all look silly. It was sort of a strategy that they laid out, believe it or not, and it worked, right? And that's it made its way into Project Blue Book, the Air Force project that people were reporting to. So that CIA convention is really considered to be sort of the turning point where ridicule was beginning to be used officially as a policy for getting people to stop focusing on this. So it's really interesting. I think that's how it all started. And it became very ingrained in the culture and the approach that the official world was taking during the 40s and 50s and 60s. And then Blue Book closed down in 1970. And then we just sort of had this wasteland period where there's no government involvement at all, but lots of civilian groups that were still monitoring things and, investigating and doing very good work. But yeah, and it just sort of became so much a part of the culture that it didn't go away. And we're still dealing with it now. And there are still factions that make use of it, right? If there are factions that don't want this information to come out, it's still useful for them to, like in the universities, you mentioned the scientists. I think it's been the most difficult for them in the universities. If they want to receive grants for research, or they want to be tenured, or they, have something at stake in their career. If they start being interested in UFOs, there could be a lot of negative repercussions on them in the university settings. It depends which one, but and that's still that stigma there, right? That it's just not okay to study this topic. It's silly. So it's still there. So it goes back so far that I think it just became entrenched, in how we all view the topic. And that was, that's changing for sure. But there's still some universities. I mean, I know people who are really interested in this. I know one person in a university who has to be extremely careful about what he says. And in another university, the guy can be as open as he wants. It just depends on the attitudes of the, people that run the university or whatever in the various departments these people are in. So there's still an issue there. Yeah. But I think it just goes so far back. That's the thing. And it was consciously used as a tool.
Yeah, it plays into a lot of things happening in today's world as well, related to so many other things. But I do want to talk a little bit about surviving death, because I saw a series during the lockdown in 2020. It was called Surviving Death, and now I know you were the consulting producer on it because it's based on your book. And first of all, congratulations.
Yeah.
uh, and I'm very curious, because as a journalist I am very curious in this topic, but sometimes the thing that holds me back is sort of, when I think about these kind of topics, they're considered more in the realm of hearsay or religious beliefs,
Right.
particularly beliefs, and convincing people of your research or findings is very hard. So how did you manage to tackle this when you're talking about something like death, which is considered more of a thing that you would probably go to a temple or a church, to talk to with the priest?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was very difficult and challenging, way more so than UFOs because of what you just said, right? And it's also much harder to get solid evidence on those things too. So what I did was I looked at all the different areas of research that involve this question of the possible survival of consciousness past death. There's lots of different avenues into that question. And so I kind of tried to distill the most evidential, the most scientific evidence that we have within each of those areas. And so for instance, near-death experiences, right? You could write a whole book about near-death experiences. I wrote a chapter or two on them, and then I would do a chapter or two on something else. And I just tried to build a sense of, you know, everything from these different independent areas of research pointing to the same conclusion, even though we can't prove it. But there is really very interesting scientific studies that have been done on that question. Very compelling. So it really takes it beyond the realm of religion, even though, of course, it's a religious question ultimately, and we can't prove the answer. And every religious path has its own perception, I guess, of what that afterlife might be like, and all kinds of things that are different. But I was trying to get to whatever might be objective about it, that's not within the context of religion. So none of the book deals with any religious beliefs or philosophies. So it's things like, for instance, the stories of young children who remember past lives. And I'm sure there's a lot of this in India. It's way more prevalent because the culture accepts it,
Yeah.
where you'll have like a 3-year-old talking about things from a past life, and he's got names, locations, family members, remembers talents that child had, whatever career they had before. And the researchers are able to actually find out who that previous person was, because there's so much information that the child provides. And so let's say the child died 5 years ago in a village somewhere else in India. They go to that village and they find out that everything that child said applies to this one person who died 5 years ago. And the family members are all accurate so he can even go visit the family, right? And he'll say, up in the attic, there's such and such a document buried under a chest, or these kinds of stuff. It's extremely like black and white, that these children remember these past lives, and there's no way to explain how they would have access to that information other than through some type of extrasensory ability. And the most logical explanation is that it is a reincarnational thing, because that's what they say it is, and they have emotions. connected to it, and all kinds of dreams. And, it's just the data there is so incredible. That was so incredible to me. That's what got me into it. And there's a program at the University of Virginia, the Department of Perceptual Studies, that has been looking into this for decades. And they had volumes of documentation of cases like this. And I was able to go there and look at them. And Ian Stevenson was the name of or you may have heard of him, who went all over the world documenting these cases of young children. And then there were some in America. So in my book, I focused on the American cases, but there aren't as many because the culture doesn't support it. So anyway, things like that, that has nothing to do with religion. It's just like, okay, the child reported these 15 points, and they were all recorded before any investigation was done. So it wasn't like anything they were learning affected what he was saying, right? By the time he's 4, he's given you these 15 data points, say, and then you get an investigator from the outside to go and put all that together and locate that previous person, and it all matches. And it's all stuff that the child couldn't possibly have known. So, and the emotional side of it, which is a big part of it, crying, missing their previous parents, that kind of thing. Having nightmares about their previous death. So, yeah, so that's how I started the book. And there was a really great, I thought the episode on the Surviving Death series on that was the last episode. Episode 6 was really good. It covered some of those cases. So yeah, and so things like that. Then there's mediumship, and there was near-death experiences, and other stuff, And so I just kind of wanted to bring it all into one volume and then let people decide for themselves. But basically, all these different cases in these areas of research kind of point to the strong possibility that there is some kind of consciousness that exists independent of the body for sure, and therefore could very well survive the death of the physical body. And just trying to look at what evidence suggests that that's the case, and there's a lot of it. There's a lot of good evidence for that. So that's kind of how the book was put together.
Is there any
challenge? It was a challenge. I was scared to do it. I didn't know what. I thought I was taking a big risk by doing it, like for the reasons you just mentioned. It's not.
I loved it. I love the series. I have to read your book now, and I'm actually curious to know: is there any particular incident that really stood out to you that wasn't mentioned in the documentary? Probably might be there in your book, but anything that sort of you think about that sends chills down your spine?
Yeah, I mean, because there's a lot in the book that wasn't in the series, and there were some things in the series that weren't in the book, so it was kind of loosely based on the book. But the one aspect that I was very interested in the book, which we really couldn't get into very much in the series, was physical mediumship at a level in which we didn't cover it in the series. And I'm working with a physical medium in the UK now. I've been working with him since 2015 or something. And he didn't want to participate in that series. He just doesn't want that kind of publicity. His name is Stuart Alexander. And in the book, I cover a lot of the historical studies done by, very skeptical scientists on some of these physical mediums who perform these unbelievable, miraculous, levitations and all kinds of interesting phenomena that took place in their environment under controlled conditions. And I'm just fascinated by that because it's sort of a way to document that these impossible events actually happen, and they happen in the physical world. It's like the crossover from some kind of world of consciousness to manifestation in the physical, which fascinates me because it's a level of proof of something. I can't say it's what, really, but I find physical mediumship, the genuine physical mediumship, there's a lot of fraud. There's, it's very controversial, but when you really look into it, I was able to learn which were the actual genuine ones from history. When, and then around the 1920s and 30s, there was just some phenomenal mediums that were studied by high-level scientists and published papers on them, books on them and stuff. So, you can tell that the controls were in place and this stuff really happened. Those were the ones I was interested in. And then the contemporary medium that I'm working with now. So that's a component that really fascinates me. That's not part of the series. I would say more than anything in the book I cover that towards the end of the book because I want to give people a chance to get ready for it because it's the hardest thing to accept, It's really hard to wrap your mind around. So yeah, I would say, and I find the cases of the young children absolutely chilling as well. We did cover that in the series, but there's a lot more to it than what you can cover in a series like that, you know? One of the chapters in my book was written by, I also have chapters written by other people in my book. So one of them was written by the lead investigator from the University of Virginia, who's been studying for decades these cases of young children. And so he wrote his own chapter so you can get more of a broad sweep. And a lot of the cases are in Asia that he has studied because it's much more common there that people report these cases, right? And that you know about them. So he did a lot of work in Sri Lanka and India and Burma and other countries like that. So yeah,
And
that also really interests me.
about the afterlife as soon as you're born, practically.
What's
Like
that?
you start thinking about the afterlife as soon as you're born, practically. Like I was told, like do good things for your afterlife.
Yeah, you were told that in India, growing up in
Yeah,
India. Yeah, like karma, right? The whole notion of karma. And yeah, I mean, I don't know about in America for it's not the same as it is in India, I don't think. Everybody's focused on their own religion, right? But in
yeah,
India, I think it's just part of the culture in a broad sense, right? The notion of doing good and having karma. And I don't think anybody would believe in India that we're not going to, that life doesn't go on after we die, right? I mean,
yeah. I don't think anyone, probably atheists, but that's a very small number. But
much smaller, much bigger in America, I'm sure, than it
y-
is in other in cultures like India. And, you know, that's just wonderful. I mean, I wish I could spend more time in those countries. But yeah, but there's been a lot of work done in those countries on these topics. So it's all there in the literature. You can read it, and it's really interesting.
yeah, and maybe I'll sync up with you separately after I've read your book, because this is a topic that keeps me up at night.
Oh,
Like,
really? Well, you should, yeah, then there you go. I think that's a calling for you to
yeah,
study more. Yeah,
very
because
cool. Yeah,
my book could give you the encapsulation of the sort of the best of the different areas of research, and then you can kind of go off in whatever, you know, go deeper in whatever area you want to follow up on. And I have a lot of references in the back for, you know, where to find things and how to go look into things more, and everything's footnoted. And so it's a good way to get you set off on your journey in the ways you want to go. So yeah,
yeah.
have fun with it. It's fascinating stuff.
Thank you so much. And I know we are almost at time, so I just have one question, and
Sure.
it's a very simple question, but it's it can be complicated as well. I just wanted to know: do you think UFOs could be connected to the afterlife?
That is such a profound question. I mean, you're right on target by asking that question, because that's one of the questions in the forefront of thinking now, of people who are thinking about this and really involved with it. And I'm most people think yes, there is some connection. These, you know, people who have studied this, I don't study it that much, but I read what other people do. And what that connection is, I don't think anybody really knows, but it seems to be becoming more and more prevalent in the way scholars and researchers think now. You know, it's like UFOs are definitely connected to consciousness in some way, right? I mean, they affect people's consciousness. Our consciousness affects them. We have recent whistleblowers have come out talking about psionics. They call them psionics, people that are able to, through their minds, attract UFOs and communicate. There's a lot of consciousness involved. Well, it's the same thing with the realm of the afterlife, whatever that is. You know, it's our minds, it's our consciousness that are interacting with it and are really creating it, I guess. So I can't really put my finger on it, but and there's also reports of cases of people having near-death experiences, you know, where they die and then come back, and they will actually see beings that look like aliens, or people that might go into have a close encounter experience in a spaceship. Again, I can't verify any of this, but they'll report seeing a dead loved one in that same environment as they're seeing a UFO, that kind of thing. So it just seems like there's some kind of overlap, and it's a mystery, and it might have to do with like the dimension that all of this happens in. You know, UFOs are able to kind of go in and out of some other dimension and, you know, disappear and go through portals and who knows? So I just intuitively, and I think a lot of people believe there is that connection. So if you ever want to take up this topic, that would be the thing to focus on. We need more research done on that and more exploration of that, even though it's very hard to study it in any kind of factual way. You know, it's a lot of that is, it's just people who think about it a lot and philosophize about it a lot and know what the data is, but also have a kind of more religious perspective on it and think, you know, that explore those kinds of questions. There's a scholar at Rice University named Jeffrey Kripal, who you might be really interested in looking at some of his work. He's a professor of religion or religious studies. And he looks at the historical record. And another writer named Diana Pasulka, who's also a religious scholar, they look at like all through the history of religions of how so many of the experiences and things that are put into religious contexts actually resemble reports of UFOs that people are having today. So it's some kind of connection, you know, between how things were reported, let's say 400 years ago, that might be the same thing that people are seeing today. They're just reported in different context. There's a lot of overlap. So they're kind of looking at how that all intersects. It's really interesting. Yeah, the Diana Pasulka and Jeffrey Kripal, I would recommend you look into their work. It's fascinating. That whole, so that's sort of one way of trying to sort of put it all together, you know, but it's an unfolding dilemma and area of great interest to a lot of people. So I think that's your calling. That's why you're up at night. You need to get onto that one and solve it for us.
Leslie, and yeah, maybe we could, we could definitely work together as well. But yeah, I think for now I'll end the conversation here, because I think this can go on for a long time, and I really wish we could do like a longer series on this topic of UFOs and the afterlife, because there's just so much.
I wish I wish I had more concrete information. I just don't. It's just so mysterious to me, you know, and a lot of it's intuitive, and I don't really know how they're connected. I just think somehow they are, you know. I don't know how much but there are plenty of people out there that could discuss it. But you interview reporters, so I don't know of any journalists that could say much about it. But there are plenty of scholars and investigators and religious scholars and so on that would have a lot to say about it. And I think the place for you to start is with those two names I just gave you. And yeah, so just carry on. I so much appreciate your interest in this.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And this was such a great conversation, enlightening conversation, actually. And thank you for sharing your tips and everything for, going about, reporting on UFOs and on the afterlife and death. And
thank you for having me. Yeah, it's been fun talking to you. Time flew by.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, Adam, I don't know if you want to say anything, but yeah, I think I'm done. But thank you so much, Leslie.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. And somebody said this has been great. I had a great time. So keep up the great work, all of you. And I hope some of you reporters listening to this will become interested in this topic. We need all the journalists we can get. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Leslie.
Okay, talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Okay.
Bye.